She signed my company away while I was recovering from surgery. She said it was to protect us. The judge asked her attorney to explain one transfer. He couldn't. My name is Scott Harmon. I'm 31 years old. I built a logistics software company from a shared desk in my brother's apartment, not a startup with investors and ping pong tables. Just me, a second-hand laptop, and about 4 years of nights I don't remember sleeping through. By the time I was 28, we had 11 clients and 3 employees. Nothing that would make the news. But it was mine. My wife and I met when I was 25. She was finishing her MBA. Smart, organized, the kind of person who color-codes her calendar and actually sticks to it. I liked that about her. I was chaotic in the way people who work alone tend to get, so she balanced things out. When we got married, she started helping with the administrative side of the company, just light stuff at first. Filing, scheduling, vendor communications. I trusted her completely. That was not a mistake at the time. I want to be clear about that. For 2 years, it wasn't a mistake at all. Then I got hurt. It was a herniated disc. Not dramatic, not an accident. Just something that happens when you spend years sitting wrong and ignoring the warning signs. I needed surgery, 6 weeks of recovery, maybe 8. My wife said she would handle things while I was down. I said okay. I was on painkillers for the first 2 weeks. I barely looked at my phone. I slept a lot, watched TV I don't remember, and trusted that things were being handled. They were, just not in the way I thought. The first thing I noticed when I came back online was an email I almost missed. It was from one of my clients, a mid-size freight company out of Ohio. They'd been with me for 3 years. The email was short. It said they were sorry to lose me, that the transition had been smooth, and that they wished me well. I stared at it for about 10 seconds before I called them. The person I spoke to sounded confused. She said my wife had contacted them during my recovery, told them I was stepping back from the company due to health reasons, and that operations were being transferred to a new entity, a consulting firm. They'd already signed the new service agreement. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat very still for a while. I didn't call my wife. I didn't say anything at dinner that night. I asked how her day was. She said it was fine. I asked about the company. She said everything was under control, clients were steady, nothing to stress about. I nodded. I went to bed early and lay there staring at the ceiling for 3 hours. The next morning, I pulled up the company accounts. I hadn't logged in during recovery, not once because she said she'd handle it. The operating account was there. The balance looked normal, but when I went back further, into the transaction history, I found transfers I didn't recognize. Not large amounts individually. Small enough to look like expenses, but consistent. Weekly, always to the same LLC. I wrote down the name. I didn't search it that day. I needed to think first. Because there's a version of this where I panic, confront her, and she has an explanation I haven't considered. Maybe it's something she set up herself for tax purposes. Maybe the accountant suggested it. People do strange things with money for legitimate reasons, and sometimes they don't explain it well. I gave her that chance, in my head. I tried to build the best case I could for her. The best case I could build didn't explain why a client had already signed with a new entity. That wasn't a tax strategy. That was a handoff. I searched the LLC name that night after she went to sleep. It was registered in Delaware. Formed 8 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm I didn't recognize. No website, no public-facing information. Just an incorporation document and an address that turned out to be a virtual office service. I kept looking. The person whose name appeared as the organizer on the filing was someone I'd never heard of, but the email address, listed in an old business filing for the same person, was one I recognized immediately. It was a variation of a name I knew. Her college roommate, they'd stayed close. I'd met her at our wedding. She worked in finance now, somewhere out in Phoenix. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next week, I moved carefully. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't ask questions. I recovered, ate breakfast, made coffee, asked my wife how work was going. She said fine. She smiled. I smiled back. At night, I went through everything I could still access. Vendor contracts, client files, correspondence. I still had my admin credentials for the company email server. I started searching there too. What I found took time to piece together, because it wasn't obvious on the surface. It was layered. But once you find one thread, you follow it. And if the structure underneath is weak, things start to come apart quickly. The core of it was this. Over the previous 8 months, my wife had been quietly transferring the company's client relationships, software licenses, and operational contracts to the new LLC. Not all at once. Slowly. A client here. A vendor agreement there. Each one with a plausible reason given in an email. She told clients I was scaling back. She told vendors the company was restructuring. And during my surgery, when I was completely offline and legally incapacitated, in any practical sense, she accelerated it. 3 clients had already fully transitioned. 2 more were in process. The company I'd built over 4 years was being hollowed out from the inside. And the shell that remained, the one with my name on it, was the one she intended to present in the divorce as having minimal value. Because I found the other thing too. She had consulted a divorce attorney 5 months before my surgery. I found the billing record in a joint credit card statement she must have forgotten we still shared. One charge. A law firm downtown, consultation fee. That was when I understood the whole picture. She hadn't decided to leave because of the surgery. She'd decided before it. The surgery was just an opportunity. 6 weeks of me being offline. Medicated. Not checking anything. The perfect window. I didn't confront her. Not then. Not yet. I kept recovering. I made dinner twice that week. We watched a show she liked. I was normal. I was so normal it cost me something I still haven't fully named. But I needed more time, and I needed her to believe I hadn't seen anything. I called someone I trusted. Not a friend, not a family member. A man I'd worked with briefly about 3 years back who'd since moved into forensic accounting. I didn't tell him it was my wife. I just described the structure, the LLC, the asset transfers, the timeline, the way the client relationships had been moved while I was recovering. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I wrote down. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing. But they got impatient at the end. He meant the last 2 weeks. The transfer rate had spiked while I was post-surgery. They moved too much too fast. On paper, the pattern was visible. That was enough for me. I spent the next 3 weeks building documentation. I requested archived statements directly from the bank, not from our shared accounts, but from the original business accounts, where I was still the primary account holder. I pulled every email I could from the server. I exported client contracts. I cross-referenced dates. I built a timeline, clean and simple, that showed exactly when each asset had moved, where it had gone, and what had been said to whom to make it happen. I also filed one document quietly, on my own, with very little fanfare. An asset disclosure notice tied to the company's original incorporation. A legal placeholder that would require any dissolution or transfer of the company's core assets to be reviewed before finalization. Timing mattered, so I scheduled it. Then I went completely still. I stopped logging into anything. I stopped requesting records. I made it look like I had accepted whatever picture she was presenting. If she was checking, I wanted her to see someone who had given up. She served me papers about 2 weeks later. I wasn't surprised. I signed the acknowledgement, handed it back to her attorney's messenger, and didn't say a word. The morning of the hearing, I put on a plain gray suit. I didn't bring a briefcase, just a folder. Single folder, not thick. I drove myself. I sat in the parking lot for about 4 minutes before I went in. She was already inside with her attorney. He was the kind of lawyer who fills space, broad shoulders, confident handshake, the type who assumes the other side is already losing. He had a stack of documents organized with color-coded tabs. I had my folder. The hearing started with standard questions: assets, liabilities, the structure of the company, its current value. Her attorney presented their version of the financials. The company had minimal operating value, he said. Client base had declined. Revenue was inconsistent. It had been overvalued on paper. My wife confirmed everything. She spoke clearly. She'd prepared. She said she had managed operations during my recovery, and that the company had struggled. That the client losses were a result of my absence, not any restructuring. The judge, a woman in her late 50s, who had clearly heard a lot of creative storytelling in that courtroom, looked at the documents for a moment. Then she looked up and asked a straightforward question. She wanted to know who the registered operator of the new LLC was. Her attorney said it wasn't relevant to the current proceeding. The judge said she'd decide what was relevant. He gave her the name. The judge wrote it down. Then she asked whether that person had any prior business relationship with either party. He hesitated. Just slightly, but I noticed it. She asked again. He said he wasn't certain. The judge looked at me then. She asked if I had anything to add before she proceeded. I said yes. I reached into the folder, not fast, not dramatic. I took out 2 documents and placed them on the table in front of her clerk. The first was the timeline, every transfer, every client communication, every date. Organized, labeled 1 page per month, 6 months of documented movement. The second was the asset disclosure notice I'd filed, timestamped. Pre-hearing. The judge picked up the second one first. She read it. Then she flipped to the attached exhibit. She read that too. Her expression didn't change, but she got very still in that particular way, that people get still when they're deciding something. She looked at my wife's attorney. "Counsel," she said, "are you aware of this disclosure?" He took the document. He read the first page. Then the second. I watched his jaw do something small and controlled, the kind of thing people do when they're keeping their face professional, while their mind is moving fast. "This wasn't part of the financial disclosure," he said. "No," the judge said. "It wasn't." My wife leaned forward and asked what it was. Her attorney didn't explain it to her, not then. The judge set the papers down. "I'm not finalizing any asset determination today," she said. "This filing indicates a pattern of undisclosed transfers that requires full review before this court can proceed." She looked directly at my wife's attorney. "I'm also referring the LLC in question for a separate inquiry regarding its formation and the transfer of business assets during a period when the primary owner was incapacitated." The word incapacitated sat in that room for a second. My wife's face didn't do anything dramatic. It just went blank. The kind of blank that happens when someone realizes the outcome they rehearsed is not the one they're standing in. Her attorney gathered his documents. He didn't look at me. The judge adjourned the session. What happened after that took months. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. But the thing about building a paper trail is that it doesn't care how much time passes. It just sits there, accurate and patient, while everything else moves around it. The LLC was examined. Her college roommate cooperated quickly once the questions became formal. She hadn't fully understood the scope of what she'd agreed to, she said. She'd set up the entity as a favor and been told it was a legitimate restructuring. Maybe that's true. I don't know her well enough to say. 3 of the 5 transferred clients came back, not because of any legal order, just because when they found out what had actually happened, they made their own decisions. 2 stayed with the new entity. I didn't fight that. I'd already decided I was done spending energy on things I couldn't control. My wife and I did not have another real conversation during those months. There were emails through attorneys. There was one brief encounter in a hallway, outside a follow-up session, where she looked at me for a second and started to say something, and then didn't. The final settlement reflected the actual value of what I'd built, not the stripped-down version she'd prepared for the courtroom. The real one. I'm not going to say it didn't cost me. It cost me a lot. Time, energy, money I spent on attorneys that I would rather have spent anywhere else. There's also the other kind of cost, the one that doesn't show up on a balance sheet, the one that lives in the part of your chest that used to trust someone completely and now knows better. But here's the thing I think about sometimes. Late at night, when I'm still up working the way I've always been. She thought the silence meant I wasn't paying attention. The silence was the most focused I've ever been. I see men in the comments sometimes who say they stayed quiet for years, that they assumed being steady and working hard would speak for itself, that they didn't think they needed to document anything, because trust was supposed to be the foundation. I understand that. I lived it. But here's what I learned. And I don't say this to be cynical about marriage or about people. I say it because it's the most practical thing I know. Document everything. Not because you expect betrayal. Because silence without evidence is just silence. And silence with evidence is something else entirely. The last thing she ever said to me directly, outside that follow-up session, was short. She looked at me for a moment in the parking lot while we were both waiting for our cars and said, "You had all of it, didn't you? The whole time." I looked at her. I nodded once. That was enough.